Hi, my name is Lawrence Byrne, and I'm the Training Director at Adventist Frontier Missions. And it's my privilege to spend the next few minutes with you talking about disciple-making movements and principles for reaching difficult places or hard-to-reach places. So I've worked for Adventist Frontier Missions for about 16 years. And over that time period, I've had the privilege of not only doing research as a doctoral student, but also working on the front lines with missionaries that are working in very difficult places to wrestle with the question of how do we establish disciple-making movements. So within that context, I'd like to share the seminar with you, Principles of Disciple-Making, Catalyzing Disciple-Making Movements, as this seminar was presented. And we're going to be looking at basically 5 major objectives in this seminar. First of all, we're going to provide an overview of the principles of disciple-making. We're going to look at guidance on how to lead a discovery Bible study. I'm going to give you a brief introduction there, plus resources that you can do a deeper dive. Then we're going to look at the vision of how to make disciples, or how disciple-making can catalyze movements, and then practical focus on sharing evangelism and the gospel with every nation, tribe, language, and people. And then how does this kind of tie in with membership retention? How does disciple-making fit in with that? And so there will be additional resources connected with this, because there's no way that we can cover all of this in just a short period of time that we have together. So when we're done, and I invite you to look online, and there'll be additional reading and online resources for you to look at that we've been looking at. Now, I just want to make a disclaimer here, and that is that at AFM we would be the last to claim that we're experts in this field. We're learning with everyone else, and if you've done other seminars, you're probably going to see some similar themes in what others are presenting, simply because we're learning. But I want to present this from our perspective. What have we learned, and what are we doing as an organization? So in order to accomplish that, the objectives as presented in this, I'm going to be looking at 4 things. We're going to look at cross-cultural church planting movements, and we're going to look at the mandate, why that's a thing, why we want to do that. We're going to look at the problem that we face, and look at 2 particular problems, that is the problem of growth and retention within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and then the challenge of cross-cultural ministry, how that complicates the issues that we have there. And then finally, I'm going to present a solution, and that is, how do we develop a movement mindset? And within that context, we're going to look at principles and then some practical things that we can do. I'm going to tell a few stories, and then I'm going to make an invitation. So that's kind of a brief overview of the seminar that we're going to do. So here on this slide here, I've got the commission of God, and there's 5 different passages, and we don't have time to go into each one of these, but I invite you to look at them. There's a remarkable parallel that we see starting with Genesis 1, verse 26 through 29, Genesis 12, verse 1 to 3, Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9, and then Revelation chapter 12, Revelation 14, rather, 6 to 12. I'd like to suggest that these represent the mission of God, or the best statement of what God's purpose is for us. Now, why this is important is because the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a mission statement, and Adventist Frontier Missions has a mission statement, which I'm going to share with you. But those mission statements are both founded on the mission of God as He presents it. And I want to share with you a brief summary of the mission of God. And I'll just say that when we do this during our summer training, we spend several hours taking a deep dive into the biblical context. So this is a brief overview. But if you look at this, you're going to see that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 29, when God declares that He's going to make human beings, He says He wants us to be in His image and likeness. That means to have His character, to represent Him and to have His character. He says He gives us authority to rule. He makes us stewards of this planet, or regions on this planet. So He gives us authority. And then finally, He blesses us. And then He says, I want you to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And of course, the question is, fill the earth with what? And what's implied is that it's God's purpose that we were to fill the earth with His image and likeness, with His authority, and with His blessing. And as you look at the trajectory of God's purpose, this is God's purpose for us before sin enters into the world. After the fall, God simply adds one more dimension to that purpose, and that is that He wants to bring us back to His original design. And you see that restated over and over again when He talks to Abraham. He says, I want you to leave your family, your clan and your country, and I want you to follow me, and I'm going to take you to a land that I'm going to show you. And in the process, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to be a blessing, and all the families of the earth are going to be blessed through you. This is restated again in Matthew chapter 28, where Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And so therefore, I want you to go and make disciples of all nations and baptize them in the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I see a connection there between the restoration of the image and likeness of God. We're going to immerse people in God's character. And then He says, I want you to teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And this process of teaching obedience is actually bringing us back to a relationship of blessing with God. And then He says, I want you to go and take that to every nation, every tribe. And then, of course, in Revelation, we see that there's the everlasting gospel is proclaimed by the first angel, and an invitation to worship God, and the one who is the creator of heaven and earth, who gave us the authority, whose image we bear, to come back into a right relationship with Him, and that the gospel is that Jesus has made a way for us to do that. And then the last two angels are a warning that this false kingdom and this false system has come to an end. And then, of course, there's this message at the end that says these people who are doing this are going to have the faith of Jesus, and they're going to be obedient to all the commandments. And so you see a connection with discipleship and the Great Commission. And so the background for a global disciple-making movement is actually not something that we do as a remedy. It's actually something that we do in order to be the remnant. It's an invitation for us to be like we were created to be disciple makers who make disciples, who fill the earth with the glory of God and the blessing of God. And the authority of God is really what we were designed for. So that presents kind of a background. And if you look at this little red box here, you see that that's the renewed or updated version of the Seventh-day Adventist Church's mission statement, which says that the mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ who live as loving witnesses and proclaim to all people everlasting gospel of the three angels' messages in preparation for His soon coming. And you can see that statement, there's a beautiful summary of the Great Commission, the Apocalyptic Commission, and then what I call the Creation Commission, as we saw in the earlier slides. Adventist Frontier Mission's mission statement is an extender of that. We exist to establish indigenous, Seventh-day Adventist church planting movements amongst unreached people groups. And if you kind of boil down what that mission statement is, take away all the adjectives, you're left with AFM exists to establish movements amongst people groups, particularly unreached people groups or the places in the world where there's it's the hardest to reach places. And so these mission statements create the challenge of how do we do this? And ever since I've joined AFM, I've been impressed by how this organization is committed to be in a mode of research and development and learning to answer this big question. It's not easy. There's no simple solutions. There's no, we've got this down if you just come and do what we're doing. As I travel around the world and consult with missionaries, daily we are wrestling with the question of how do you do this and apply this. There's two significant challenges that the Seventh-day Adventist Church faces today in fulfilling this mission. And then a third one that compounds the first two when it comes to cross-culture. And I'm going to look at those now. So the two challenges are the challenge of growth and retention. And as we look at the challenge of growth here, you're going to see this graph here with these blue lines. What the blue lines represent is world population. When the Seventh-day Adventist Church has its earliest records of membership, and then going all the way to 2015. And you can see that there's a steep growth in global population, especially in the last probably 20, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe a little bit more. There's a blue line that if you look very carefully at this graph, there's a blue line that represents the end of year church membership. And I've got a little box, a red box around the last, say, 15 years, 20 years. And if you look very carefully, you can see the very thin green line as a percentage of world population. And what that shows us is if you look at the data, if you look at the numbers, the Seventh-day Adventist Church membership as a percentage of world population has only changed about 0.27% over the last 150 some years. And this graph here presents to us the absolute magnitude of the challenge that we face in fulfilling the commission of taking the gospel to every tribe, nation, language, and people as found in the three angels' messages. You add to this the challenge of reaching the unreached. And if you look at joshuaproject.org, you'll see here this graph representing, and I'm going to just show you a little more detail here. This shows from Joshua Project. You can look it up online. You'll see the red dots represent unreached people groups. And then, of course, you've got yellow and orange and yellow and then light green and dark green representing the places that have the maturest Christian organizations and movements within those places. But you can see here that whether you look at people groups or you look at just pure global population, you have about 40% of the world which is completely outside of the reach of the gospel, that really requires cross-cultural missionaries in order to reach those people groups. So 60% within the reach and then 40% unreached. And so this presents a tremendous challenge to us as well, in addition to the question of growth. Okay, I want to share this little movie with you here, and just watch as you see how the different world religions have changed since 1945, at least according to this presentation. This slide here represents the world divisions of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So the way that the General Conference, as you know, is divided into 13 divisions and some attached fields. And you can see here a graphical representation that comes from the Archives and Statistics website. And just to get a perspective in terms of where we are as a global membership, put that membership in perspective. You can see here, this is the annual statistical report for the General Conference that comes from 2020, that's presented this year. And if you look down in the bottom corner, you're going to see the numbers there that right now the Seventh-day Adventist Church is around 21 million members, and we've really celebrated the growth of the church. But just to put that into perspective in terms of this global challenge and what percentage we are of the world population, just to put that into perspective, the population of Sao Paulo is currently around 22 million people. And this graphic here gives you some idea. If you look at the whole world and you look at the population of Sao Paulo, or the city of Sao Paulo, if you took every single Adventist in the world, you could fit them in this place. This is where 22 million people live today. This tiny little dot on our planet. So it really represents the magnitude of the task that's ahead of us. Now, so in terms of growth, we're growing really slowly, just a few percentage points every year. And then in addition to that problem, we have the problem of retention. So you can see here, Sao Paulo is just this tiny little dot on the planet. So let's look at the challenge of retention. In 2015, Dr. Trim of the Office of Archives and Statistics made a presentation looking at the fact that church membership and church death rates around the world was just lagging way behind, sometimes 30-40% lower than some countries. And so the church over the last several years has done a very rigorous job attempting to make sure that the numbers that we're presenting in terms of what our membership actually is, that those numbers are more accurate. And as we look at that, we see that the problem of retention is actually much bigger than we've been willing to admit. So here he presents over the period of time 1965 to 2014. There was an average of 39.25% attrition. That's almost 40%. So for every 10 people who joined the church, 4 people would leave the church over that 50-year period. This comes from the document. You can see the link there, and this will be available in the material that you can download if you want to do a deeper dive into that. I did my own research as part of some classwork for a doctoral program that I'm in, and when I came up, I looked at the year 2007 to 2017, and just to explain that the numbers that I'm going to be presenting are a little bit worse than what David Trim presents, and probably the reason for that is that the divisions have been working very hard to actually have more accurate numbers. That some of the divisions have been very, very aggressively doing aggressive membership audits, and so therefore you've seen some major reduction in the number of members that you see in those divisions. But this just gives you the raw data there. And then here's a summary. And I don't have the divisions listed there, but you can see that there's 2 divisions that had, over that 10-year time period, that had registered 100% attrition or more. And the average attrition was 47% over that period of time. So that means that almost 50%, 1 in 2 people that joined the church left the church over that period of time. Over that same period of time, we had an average of about 2% growth globally. Okay, So if we look at the challenge of taking the gospel to the whole world as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that's really our mission, to make disciples of all nations and to prepare the world for the second coming of Jesus. We look at the growth of our membership, and we look at the way that we've been doing evangelism, the way that we've been, our strategies. We have two major problems that we need to address. One is the question of growth. And as we look at world population growth, and we look at the challenge of the challenge of attrition, that 1 in 2 people are leaving the church, the problem or the need for disciple making, and disciple making as a central and critical part of our church growth strategy has really risen, not only within Adventist Frontier Missions, but within the larger Adventist Church. And if you go online and look at the documentation at the General Conference, etc., you're going to see there's a lot of talk about disciple making that needs to be added to what we do. And I want to suggest that in order to address these two problems and to do that within a cross-cultural context, it's going to take much more than simply adding discipleship to the structures and to the strategies that we currently have. That we need to have we need to embrace what I would like to suggest is a movement mindset, and I'm going to try to explain what that is. But before we do that, I'm going to look at one more dimension of challenge, and that is the challenge of reaching the unreached, or cross-cultural ministry. This picture here that shows a group of gentlemen in Papua New Guinea in their traditional attire, and then a person who's dressed very much like myself, wearing a suit, is probably one of the best representations of the challenges of cross-cultural ministry. The first thing that we often think about when we talk about the problem of working cross-culturally is language barriers, and it's well known that in Adventist Frontier Missions, one of the first tasks of a missionary is to do the hard work of breaking the linguistic barrier. But we also understand that there's a cultural barrier behind that this picture beautifully represents, that the way that people dress and eat and the conventions that they have for getting things done. And then deeper than that, when we talk about worldview, the assumptions that they make are major barriers to cross-cultural communication. And AFM, our Adventist Frontier Missions, has faced that for many years. One of the things that I've appreciated about working at AFM is the fact that we have a culture of failing and then not wasting our mistakes. And so over the years, the question of what's gone wrong and how do we fix that has really driven us to deeper thinking. And this idea of a movement mindset kind of comes out of that as well. So I want to share with you very briefly, and as I say, this could be shared we have a teacher that does this in our training that spends 2 weeks unpacking this. So I'm going to do this in just a few minutes here. We had a gentleman by the name of Dale Goodson. He went to do evangelism in Papua New Guinea. With his family. He gave over 400 Bible studies and had hundreds of interests of people that were really interested, and then 28 baptisms after 3 years, and he thought he was doing really, really well. While he was on furlough, 100% of the people that he had worked with and baptized apostatized, and he came back just really, really discouraged, really feeling like he was a failure. And so he wrestled with just giving up and going back, and he decided, if I don't do that, if I don't figure out what went wrong, somebody else is going to come and make the same mistakes that I did. And so he did a deep dive into the culture, and he realized that cross-cultural missions, or being a cross-cultural missionary, meant that you had to have a different way of thinking, that you couldn't just come and share the answers to the questions on the places where you'd come from. So in order to put this back together again, he spent about 1,000 hours working with local leaders, thought leaders, and spiritual leaders to try and understand the culture and the worldview of the people that he was working with. And there was a gentleman by the name of Iwala, and what he learned was that all of the work that he was doing and all of the way that he was studying the Bible wasn't answering the question of the people. He says, you didn't answer my questions. You didn't clear away the spiritual confusion that I had. You were answering questions that were raised in another context, in another country. And that's one of the problems with us creating Bible studies for one group and then simply translating them into another, so that other people in other contexts, often they may have value, but they often don't answer the questions that they have, the spiritual questions that they have, or clear away the spiritual confusion that they have because of their worldview assumptions. So here's an example where the missionary says, God is love, and He wants to protect us, and the listener is actually thinking, yes, sickness is a form of immediate spiritual punishment, and so when the missionary says, I want you to stop smoking, the assumption is that God must be angry with smokers and that He punishes them, that there's not a natural physical connection between smoking and health, that there's actually a spiritual component, that God is actually punishing those who smoke, because that's a fundamental tenet of animism. Another example, a person says, well, I chewed betel nut and I smoked, nothing happened to me, but when I went trapping on the Sabbath, a tree fell on my head, so the Sabbath must be important. And then chewing betel nut and smoking must be okay because you don't get immediately sick when you do that. This is an example of how the missionary can be saying one thing that makes sense within their context, but it's actually being interpreted through their worldview, the worldview filters of the hearers, and we may not understand that what we're saying and what's being understood are two different things. Another dimension that we often overlook and we don't understand is that when we present Christianity, especially the way we practice it in the West, it can seem like a very small package or have very little to offer to people who live in animist context or in contexts where spirituality is pervasive within their lives. And so this graphic here represents different dimensions of life: marriage and sickness and birth and worship and celebrations and gardening and work. And you can see there that from an animistic perspective, that every dimension of life is covered, has spiritual connections, and that people and the spiritual leaders are involved in every dimension. Whereas in Christianity, we have very little to say about spirituality or Christianity and work. Maybe kind of at a higher level, but at a practical sense, no. And definitely not much about gardening when it comes to spirituality. And then celebrations and birth, and maybe just a little bit, maybe a prayer or a baby dedication. And in many of these countries and many of these religions, it seems like Christianity is actually a very, very thin or has a very, very weak offering. That's actually not true. That's just simply how we live it in the West. We live very isolated and dualistic lives in the West. That if you look at a biblical model of Christianity and you understand a discipling paradigm, spirituality and Christianity fill every part of life. That there's no dividing line in the Bible between what's sacred and what's secular. That there's this holy space, that we are a holy priesthood. This next few slides kind of represent the task of a missionary working cross-culturally, and you have a gentleman here with blue glasses on and a gentleman with green glasses, and the understanding is that we're actually looking through different worldview assumptions, different lenses out at the world, and that one of the tasks of a missionary, although this is an ideal that nobody actually fully attains, because unless you grow up in a culture, that's the only way you can really fully understand the worldview of this particular community. But one of the tasks of a missionary is to come to understand how, and that's represented by both people having the green lens, come to have a deeper understanding of the worldview assumptions that the people group is making. And then the next step is to not just have those assumptions, but to take the next step and actually both move towards having a biblical worldview, or embracing what the Bible says that is true about God and about reality. And once again, that's not an absolute that you can suddenly move towards. It's a slow progression, and both the missionary and those that the missionary is working to reach are on a journey together to discover as God reveals His will in their context through His Word and through living in community. And my friends, that's really what discipling and disciple-making movements are all about. It's about grounding people in this experience. So I have a very short little video here that I want to show you that kind of demonstrates this principle of cross-cultural ministry. And here we have a gentleman that's telling a story, and I want you to see if you can guess what story this is. And I want to ask if someone came to preach like this in your church, or to do evangelism like this in your church, how successfully would that be? So that video is actually the story of Noah. And when AFM was working amongst the Himba, we realized that our missionaries there realized that people couldn't remember what we were sharing from one week to the next when we were doing it in the way that we do in the West. But when they learned that the people actually acted out and sang the most important things in their community, and we translated the Bible stories into songs, that really stuck. And we have a story of an old man that listened to a tape until the batteries went down, and he asked for new batteries because he said, "This is the first time I've heard God speaking to me in my language." And so as missionaries and as disciple makers, we have this tremendous responsibility not only to present the gospel, but to do it in a way that is incarnational, that is presented so that the people can understand within their context and within their language, and that our way of communicating it is not a barrier. So what's the solution to these problems? The problem of growth, the problem of retention, and the problem of cross-cultural ministry. I want to suggest that having a movement mindset that is based on disciple-making or disciple-making movements is really the solution. And I want to present movement principles and then look at some practical structures and then tell a couple of stories, and then we'll be done. So David Garrison, and you'll see a book written by him in the bibliographic material that you can download, presents several important principles for disciple-making movements or for church planting movements in one of his books. And he talks about 10 things. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can pause this and you can take a closer look. But he points out that extraordinary prayer is one thing that you see in every place. And in my research and my experience, where there's a phenomenal, persistent, deep dive into seeking partnership with God, seeking God to do what only He can do, that kind of prayer is what opens the door for disciple-making movements. There's also an aggressive and open way of declaring that you're Christians. He talks about abundant evangelism. He talks about understanding and recognizing the authority of Scripture, developing local leadership, house churches, and then churches, planting churches, and then rapid reproduction. And this rapid reproduction is not super rapid. It's probably within 3-year to 4-year periods of time. He talks about how that there's 10 common elements in every church planting movement. So there's actually a lot of uncertainty that people have to live with. There's often when there's movements taking place, there's something that's preventing influence from the outside, that the whole families are coming together rather than extracting people. That's another very important dimension of it. That often church planting movements are accompanied with God's demonstrations of God's power. He talks about signs and wonders. But as from Adventist Frontier Missions perspective, we've seen that in places around the world, people aren't so interested in what is true, but what works, what is powerful. And of course, we know that that truth does matter. But if you're working with a group of people that that really don't mind or care about propositional truth. They actually want to know what practical truth is. That it's really important that you come with the assumption that God can act in their lives, that God can show himself powerful in their lives. And then often that when there's movements, there's also suffering. So these are some of the principles that David Garrison speaks of when he talks about church planting movements. There's 7 deadly sins that Garrison mentions that I think are very thought-provoking, that we actually have blurred vision, and that means that we're not single-minded. As a matter of fact, wherever I've seen church planting movements taking place or multiplying disciples that are making disciples, there's this overwhelming sense of a single-minded purpose, that this is the main thing, that developing people and developing their walk with God is the main thing. Improving on the Bible, he suggests that wherever we find people working or trying to develop all kinds of complex resources, that's actually slowing down movements. Sequentialism is thinking about steps rather than understanding that there's organic systems that are working. The devil's candy is things that are distractions from the main thing, and then blaming God when he talks about alien abduction. That means when we come in from the outside and we think that as foreigners we are superior to the people that we're working with, and rather than having a mindset of empowering locals and then blaming God for our failures, rather than turning inward and saying, God, what do we need to change? And there's more to that, and I encourage you to look at David Garrison's work, thought-provoking presentation. Another dimension of the principles of leadership, of disciple-making movements, is understanding leadership development. This is a graph that is presented by David and Paul Watson in their book, which I've shared with you in the downloadable resources. And they make a very interesting point. They say that often when we think about church and church growth, we turn to the few leaders who have this incredible capacity to lead many. And their point is that for every 10 people that can lead 1,000, there's 1,000 people that can lead 10. And if we want to see growth, we need to be really developing structures and strategies for growing micro leaders and micro leadership development strategies. And you're going to see this as fundamental to church planting movements, is these micro leadership development strategies, and that we can have tens of thousands of people who can lead 10. So you can have hundreds of millions of people that are involved in discipleship movements or disciple-making movements if our core strategy is leadership development of people who can lead small groups of 10. There's a number of counterintuitive paradoxes. I'm not going to go into detail with all of these, but these are also presented in materials presented by David and Paul Watson. And I think it's worth just mentioning a few of them. Number one is go slow to go fast. Work with focus on a few in order to win many. Share only when and when people are ready to hear. So that's part of going slow to go fast. A new insider is actually more effective than a highly experienced outsider. And so have a mindset of empowering people within frameworks and in structures to share their faith. An example of this would be the woman at the well. That when you've had a genuine experience and encounter with Jesus Christ, immediately you're equipped to go and tell people, here's a man, come and meet a man that have told me everything that I've ever did. Another example of this is the demoniac. Once Jesus met him, he begged to go with Jesus and say, can I follow you? And Jesus says, no, I want you to go and tell all of your friends and family what I've done for you. And so when you have a discipleship encounter or an experience with Jesus, you're equipped immediately to go and share that experience with others. Whereas when we think about propositional truth, often it takes years and years and years to master the complex theological systems in order to be able to be qualified to teach. And so not that those are mutually exclusive, because we do need to have solid theology and we need corpuses of cohesive truth. But disciple making is really based on the following of a man, and that Jesus is committed to walking with us on our journey towards truth. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so disciple making focuses on connecting people with the person of Christ through his word in a journey that is transformational. Another one is that you start with creation and not Christ, and so it's actually going chronological Bible storying as a fundamental principle of disciple-making movements. It's about discovery and not preaching or teaching. And so this is a very controversial one because this here is teaching. But here's the idea that when we help people to discover God's message for them in His Word, and I'm going to show you a discovery Bible study, we're actually empowering people to learn as equals from the Word. And I got to tell you, just a few weeks ago, I was in a Bible study with a group of people that had been gathered from a community in South Africa. And we had a group of people or believers, but not of my faith. And we're studying a passage that I've taught many, many times, but we're doing it in a discovery method where we're basically reading this passage and listening to it. And one of the ladies there shared an insight that deeply impacted me. And I was reminded once again that when we come to the Word as a group, in order to learn to hear what the Word is saying to us, and we're willing and open to learning with each other as we sit at the feet of the Word, that no matter how long you've been teaching or how short a person has been, when the Holy Spirit moves, He actually opens our minds to insights that you would never have expected. Another one is obedience is more important than knowledge. And often when we have seminars like this, we're presenting a bunch of information, and then there's no expectation of actually implementation. It's one of the major flaws in this kind of teaching. Whereas in disciple-making movements, we're going very slowly, sharing one story, one principle at a time, and then we create the expectation of actually implementing that 1 week at a time. And that process in itself is transforming. The idea of letting lost people facilitate discovery in the Word as they learn the authority of the Word, that we disciple people towards conversion, and not that they're disciples until they converted, because they're not, but we're discipling them. That means that we have a relationship of engagement with them in the process of coming to Christ. And then when they do come to Christ, nothing changes. We continue to walk with them and develop them. So another major principle is prepare to spend a long time, but anticipate miraculous acceleration. So you're going to go deep in order to go wide. You're going to work with a few to reach many, and that's going to take time. Typically 2 to 2.5 to 3 years of deep investment. And then as you've invested in people and you've trained leaders and multipliers, over that period of time, you start seeing exponential growth as people then learn not only to be followers and not only to be facilitators of others' experience, but actually to multiply themselves. We start to see a principle of multiplication take place. Another principle is the best time to start a church is when it's new. That buildings often slow church growth down. That's a principle that we've seen across multiple studies. And then paid local leaders often kill church planting because only people who are paid end up doing the work. And so we see that as another way of stopping movements rather than helping to facilitate them. Rather than focusing on professionals, you focus on ordinary people. And then sometimes the hardest places actually yield the greatest results. And finally, sometimes it takes small for-profit ventures that actually can help people to be financially viable in order to meet real needs within the community in financially viable ways to help the work to go forward. So those are a few movement principles that we've gleaned and wrestled with and struggled with how we would implement within our context and within Adventism. And I invite you to look at them thoughtfully and critically yourselves. So we're going to look at a few structures here. There's 2 books that are foundational to many people who are thinking about and wrestling with disciple-making movements. One is written by Smith and Kai, and the other one is by Watson, son and father. And they present a fundamental structure for disciple-making that describes what happens when you're actually having a disciple-making community or you're having disciple-making meetings. And on the left-hand side is Watson's Discovery Bible Study, and on the right-hand side is Ying Kai's 3/3. And you can see, I'm going to look at those in a little bit more detail here for you. Here's the 3/3, and I'm going to just focus. You can read his book, Training for Traders. It's the book and resources are listed in the downloadable materials. But there's actually 4 things that are bold there, and these are the most important things in this structure. And that there's accountability, that there's vision casting, that this is not just a Bible study that we're wanting to reach all the people in this area. What's it going to take to reach everyone within this area? Number 6 is practicing the lesson. So you actually do a Bible study, but then you practice not only sharing that, but what are you going to do with that? And then setting goals for next time. What is it that we're going to do between now and the next time we meet? So these are the fundamentals of training for trainers and how they go about training for trainers. And then this is what we call the Discover Bible Study. There's 6 questions that they ask. What are you grateful for? And then after the first week, for the second week, you ask accountability questions. How did it go with the commitments that you made? There's 3 commitments that people make every time that they gather with this and within this paradigm. The third one is, are there any needs within the community? The fourth one is, how can we meet those needs? And the fourth one is, I like to over here, there's 4 R's. In a Discovery Bible Study, you read a text, and then you reflect on the text, or you retell the text. So you read the text, you retell the text, and then you reflect on it by asking 2 questions. What does this teach us about God? What does it teach us about us? And then you respond to the text. So there's 4 R's that you do in response to a text. And then the question is, who will you share with? Who can you share this, what you've learned, or how the Holy Spirit touched you? Who could you tell that's within your network? Now, what's so phenomenal about this? This is a method. It's not the only way to do it. And the reason I'm sharing 2 different ways with you is to show you that this is not about a method, but it's about understanding the principles that the purpose of a gathering is actually to make disciples. And these are structures that different people have come up with that are actually designed to be disciple-making communities. And you can see this. I'm going to explain these 6 questions in a little bit more detail on this next graph. So in the first column here, we can see that's actually what we're doing. And you can take a closer look at that. The second column says, this is why we're doing this. Okay, so when we say, what are you grateful for? We're actually teaching people to worship. When we ask people, when we hold people accountable, we're teaching loving biblical accountability. When you make a commitment, how do we hold each other accountable to that commitment? When we're looking for needs, we're teaching people to live aware of the needs of those around you, or to teach people how to actually embrace Christ's method alone, which was to mingle with men as one who desired their good. So how do you do that? You have your mind open to the needs of people around you. And then not only was Christ's method mingling with people, but he ministered to their needs. And so when you're ministering to the needs of others, you're recognizing that God has made us people who can bless, who should be blessing others. And so we share the blessing. So when we share what we're grateful for in the first question, we're responding to the blessing of God. When we find the needs of those around us and then we minister to those needs, we're actually sharing the blessing of God. And then he says, come follow me. And the invitation then is to go to actually invite people to come and study the Bible together in a Discovery Bible Study. And what are we teaching there? We're teaching people how to have a discipling relationship with the Word, or with Jesus Christ through the Bible. Remember, Jesus says, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. So if you look at the corpus of Scripture, that's everything that Jesus has commanded us. And a discipling community or discipling relationship is where we actually read the Scripture in order to hear what the text says and then apply that in obedience to our lives. And then the final one is when you invite people to share, we're actually teaching them how to be evangelists or how to be witnesses. And we're doing this at a micro level, and I call this micro leadership development. And then there in the final column shows you what we are teaching. So rather than teaching what the Bible says, we're teaching people how to listen to the Bible. That's what a discipling community is. Rather than leading people in worship as entertainment, we're actually inviting people into worship in response to the blessings of God. Rather than having the professionals do ministry. We invite everyone to be engaged in life throughout the week, looking at needs and meeting those needs in the context that they're working in. So this group here is kind of the fundamentals of a church. This is what a church, this is the fundamentals of what a church does. This is a biblical church community. But the purpose of this group is actually to empower people to go and be the church in the community. And that, my friends, is what disciple-making movements are really all about, is people being empowered to be blessing in the world, to bring God's blessing and God's image into the world. So here's a summary of what we've just been talking about, these bullet points here that demonstrate or outline the different components of a discovery Bible study or a disciple-making Bible study, a disciple-making community. So we look at the different things that we're teaching: gratitude, we're teaching attentiveness to the needs of others, we're teaching responsiveness to the needs of others, we're teaching accountability and providing feedback, loving feedback that encourages people to grow. We're teaching people how to hear the word of God and then respond to that in obedience, and then how to share that with others, which is witness. And so you can see the structure really invites us into a lifestyle of following God. There's a gentleman by the name of Stephen Addison who has he's really dedicated his life to studying and articulating and encouraging people who are interested in disciple-making movements and multiplying disciples. And his book here, Pioneering Movements, focuses on principles of leadership development. I encourage you to buy the book and read it. But here's a brief summary of the core concepts that if you think about the structures of disciple-making movements and how leadership development takes place. So you can see here that he's got a little model where he's suggesting that we live with a vision for disciple-making movements, that we connect with people, we share with them, we train them, and then we gather them into communities, and then we multiply that. Okay, so that's how he's presenting that. There's actually, if you want to go online or look at our resources, we'll put this in there. There's with the people who do training for trainers, or T4T, they talk about the 4 fields as a model for multiplying disciples. Each person's got their own way of describing what it looks like to have a movement mindset. And Adventist Frontier Missions, we talk about 3 things. We talk about practice, connect, and multiply. First of all, we practice following Jesus. We practice that by ourselves and together. And then we connect with others. What are ways that we connect with others? And then how do we multiply practicing and connecting so that instead of having a mindset of addition, we have a mindset of multiplication. Stephen Addison presents this little picture, and then he presents 5 levels of leadership that are part of disciple-making movements. The first one is what he calls seed sowers. He says this should be everybody. Everyone should be a seed sower. And these are people who are equipped as followers of Jesus Christ to share their own testimony, to share the gospel, to invite people to follow Jesus, and then to start groups of people who study the Bible together, or to invite people to join them in following Jesus. And that when people say yes to that, then you become a church planter. And a church planter is someone who's gathering a group of people, can be in a home, under a tree, in a library, in some third space where people are willing to meet. And this is where you're actually practicing discipleship together and doing what we call a discovery Bible study. But that's not enough. In 1 and 2, we're growing by addition. Growing by multiplication is we get a church multiplier, and this is not someone who's just planted one church, but you can see there that there's actually 4 generations of churches or groups or discipling communities that have been started. This is where we shift from addition to multiplication and learning how to do that. Now there's another level of leadership, and these are what are called multiplication trainers. These are the people who've had experience and that are actually helping church planters become church planting multipliers. Okay, so you can see here the church multiplier is trained by a multiplication trainer to be to go from one church into multiple groups, because it's one thing to be a seed sower, it's another thing to gather your first group. But then how do you coach those in the group? How do you train those in the group to and pray with those in the group to actually start your first, second generation, first, third generation, and fourth generation groups. That's what a multiplication trainer. And then you've got movement catalysts of people, this is their fifth level that he's describing, are people who are working cross-culturally in multiple different contexts and to catalyze church planting movements. And that you need these different kinds of leadership that grow from the ground up that are fundamental to church planting movements. So what does it look like to have a movement mindset? And I want to suggest, people have talked to me, and I've done a significant study thinking about how do church planting movements fit within the structures of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I would like to say that some people have said to me, well, I don't know if it could ever fit within Adventism because of the church structures. And I've come to realize that it's not the church structures that are a challenge. It's actually how we think within those structures. That when we have a mindset shift, and the structures of the church could actually be phenomenal for empowering and releasing church planting movements around the world in these last days. So I'd like to encourage you to take a look at discipleshipcourse.org. This is by a dear friend of mine, Michael Dornbruck in Germany. Has been responsible for a small training school there, and he's really done a tremendous job and created fantastic resources that can be used within Adventism. It's created within a German context that will help and to embrace a movement mindset. And there's a lot more there that you can follow. This is just a clip from their website, and I just want to encourage you to go and take a look at what Michael has done there with his community. I want to just tell you a story. There's a lady in the middle here. Her name is Ida, and she is from the Philippines, and she worked with one of our missionaries there by the name of John Holbrook. When I've met Ida for the first time, she was a single parent and living in a very rustic home in a village up in the mountains in the Philippines. And one day, John and I had been working together, and he'd been studying church planting movements and these structures for some time. And as we were working together, he decided that he was going to train any church members that were willing or interested to do discovery-type Bible studies. And Ida was one of the few people that came to him. A single mom with small children. She was kind of living in a community where people survive by subsistence farming. She came to him and said, I've wanted to give Bible studies all my life, but it's always been too complicated, but I can do this. I can read a passage with people, and then we can ask these two questions. What does this teach us about God? What does this teach us about us? And then how do we obey? And how do we hold each other accountable? I want to do that. And so he taught her and gave her a list of texts to work through. And she went and found a family that lived in another part of the village where she lived. And she started having Bible studies with them. And they couldn't read very well in their comprehension. They kind of struggled to remember what they'd read. So they went through very slowly. And basically what happened is they started at night and they worked together and read and studied and discussed the Word until they got sleepy. And they went night after night. And after 3 months, she came to John and she said, my friends are ready for baptism. And she was just so excited that this family had decided to join the Seventh-day Adventist Church because of her work. She said to him, I've come from a village several miles away, and there's no Adventist church there. If you'll help me, I'll plant a garden to support my family and I. But if you'll help me maybe build a little home so I can live there, I'll go and start a work there in my village. And she did. She went there and she started doing discovery kinds of Bible studies with people in her village. And if you look carefully at this picture, you see that there's wood on the ground there. That wood was there. That was wood that they had gathered to build their first little church where they could gather to have host church. And so this lady, who I would have told you would be one of the last people that I would have thought of being a church planter, was empowered to be a disciple-making disciple. Here's a picture of her little home that she lived in, and Ida has been such an inspiration to me. If Ida can do that, then I can do it, and anyone can be a disciple-making Christian. So what is the conclusion of this matter? I believe that God is calling us to be part of His kingdom-building mission in the world. That Jesus called us to make disciples of all nations and to teach them to obey everything that He has commanded. He commanded us to make disciples, and He told us to teach them to obey everything, including making disciples. And so what that says to us is that the principle of multiplication is at the heart of the Great Commission. That making disciples is really the measure of the success of the work that God is calling us to do. And I think that this not only addresses the issue of growth, it also addresses the issue of retention, because people who are engaged in a lifestyle of following Jesus Christ and seeing the power of His ministry and the miracles working in their lives are going to stay faithful to Him and walk with Him. And then, instead of having spectators watching specialists, we have multiplying disciples that are taking the church into the world rather than coming to church once a week and then going into the world to live ordinary lives. So this calls us to actually take, the movement mindset calls us to take multiplication and to practice it in the face of persecution. So what's the conclusion of the matter? Why is it important that we embrace cross-cultural church planting movements as a priority? Well, I believe that, first of all, it's the mission of God. That God's gave us the mission of taking this gospel to all the world in our generation. That the gospel, everlasting gospel, is to be preached to every nation, tribe, language, and people. And that He wanted us to establish churches amongst family units. That was His plan from the very beginning. And that multiplication was His design for us in creation and in redemption. And that God's purpose was for us to fill the earth with His image and likeness, with His authority and with His blessing, and to do that through the process of disciple making. And so a movement mindset is really what God's calling us to. It's not just about planting churches, but training trainers of church planting trainers is the foundation of what we're inviting, what we are being invited to be when Jesus calls us to come follow Him, and then He commands us to make disciples. And that's what we're striving to do at Adventist Frontier Missions. It's not easy. It's easier to talk about it in a seminar than to actually live it in our lives. We all struggle with that. And we're not claiming to be the be-all and end-all, especially myself. But we want to invite you, want to present an appeal that if you're interested in being part of this movement and being part of this journey and seeing that curve, that very flat curve of church growth change from 2% to 3% to 50 to 60% growth, because 60% of the members of the church are multiplying, and our goal is not baptisms, not just believers, but disciples and disciple makers. That's the appeal that we have, and I want to invite you to consider not just doing this in your context. If you're called to do that in your context and you do, that's fantastic, but to actually be part of doing this cross-culturally amongst the unreached. If we can facilitate that calling as an organization, it would be such an honor to work with you in training and then to support you as you go out into the front lines to do that. Thank you for this time together, and I look forward to sharing some questions and answers with you.